you to think about what's at stake, first of all, in this conversation. And what I'm hoping I'm going to be able to lead you through to is an idea that understanding Israel's relationship to the Holocaust is nothing less important than making sure that we are legitimizing the existence of the State of Israel every time we think and talk about it. And I want to start there with a kind of silent audience participation. I'd like you to think through your own narrative of how Israel was born relative to the Holocaust. What's the story you would tell someone else or that you tell yourself? And I'd like you to start by thinking about that narrative compared to a couple of the images I'm going to show you. The first one is this picture taken in Europe in 1947, after the Exodus, the famous ship carrying hundreds of Holocaust survivors to Israel in an attempt to illegally break the blockade of immigration. It was sent back, and it caused demonstrations and uprisings throughout Europe that in some part led to a change in understanding or perceptions about what was then called Palestine. Or is your narrative a little bit more like this? This is the Atlantic Charter. It was signed by Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in August of 1941. And in it, in the third sort of codicil, I guess, it says that they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. This document was signed, think about the time, before America had formally entered the war, August of 41. Pearl Harbor had not happened. No declaration of war against Germany or Japan. And Winston and Churchill and Roosevelt were still concerned at that time with talking about what the war was going to be like when it was over. This was a charter of principles by which the world would be ordered after the hostilities were finished. There were territorial compromises in there. There's a commitment to disarm all nations involved. There's an economic plank that's going to take out the kind of deadly reparations that came out of the restitution that Weimar Germany had to pay, which in some ways started to lay the groundwork or the foundation for the Holocaust. They wanted to really write a new history for the world. The key phrase I want you to focus on there is chapter 3, where we talk about self-determination. And now I want you to look at this map. This is, it's self-explanatory. Colonization in Africa, Middle, and Near East in 1945. If you move that map forward 11 years and think about what countries were still colonized then, all of the countries in the Mediterranean sort of loop there, and all of the neighbors that are contiguous with Israel today, we can name them, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, gained their independence. In other words, within 10 years, the entire map of self-determination and colonization changed. So I'd like to submit that Israel's birth was more an expression of self-determination that was an expression of the first narrative, the idea that an aggrieved people, victimized in a way no people had ever been victimized in history, were given or granted or deserved to have, finally, their own country. Instead, I submit that those forces, the Exodus and Aliyah Aleph, Aliyah Bet, the movements of people to Israel as part of a Zionist expression that started at the end of the 19th century, were proximate causes, but they weren't ultimate causes. The ultimate cause was an international realignment of powers that gave all the countries around us, I'm being very general in our sense of Israel, their independence, and it gave us our independence as well. Now we can talk a little bit, the Israel situation is a little bit different because we were partitioned. Egypt was never partitioned. Libya was kind of a reversal where several areas came together, and by the way, we're seeing the results of that to some extent today as the country's spiraling into anarchy. The UN got involved in Israel in a way that other countries didn't. But those I'm going to put in the category of details that we can argue and discuss, but the fundamental movement I submit would have given Israel its country all by itself. So what does that mean? Is that when we talk about Israel in the marketplace of countries, we have to banish from our minds the ideas that there was a cause and effect relationship to the Holocaust. And to do anything less is to allow others to say that we don't have as much a legitimate right to our biblical and historical claim to that land than any of the other peoples who surround us. That leaves us, well, that was great, that takes care of 1948, what about the next 60 years? So let's look at some data points that we can sort of plot together to understand, or really it's kind of a messy relationship. Let's just get some ideas in our heads and sort of have them competing with each other. The first one that I think is really interesting is what I call the Giborization of Israel. Gibor, the Hebrew word for hero. The idea that Israel is an attempt, after the fact, we're defining ourselves as an attempt to rewrite our own experience of victimhood by being powerful, by being able to defend ourselves. And one of the first things that they enact in the state of Israel is the Yom HaShoah. 1951, it's determined to occur on the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was, I think, April 14th. It's the day before Passover. The actual day, you're going to say, Mark, no, that's wrong. The actual day is after Passover. Right. What Jewish woman is going to want to remember anything except cleaning her house the day before Passover? So they couldn't do that. They moved it till after Passover. But the initial impetus was to time it to one of the most important expressions of Jewish independence or Jewish revolt. Now, tragically, the Warsaw Ghetto was a Pyrrhic victory at best. We know what happened there. But it was the moment Israel chose to seize in its first efforts to memorialize that history of victimization. And it was a moment of the Jew standing up and saying, no more, Dayenu for this tragedy. 1952, September, possibly the worst riots that may have ever occurred in Israel, certainly in the young country's history. Literal violence over the Luxembourg Agreement. What was this agreement? It was an agreement that David Ben-Gurion pushed through with Germany to allow reparations to be paid from Germany to Israel. It was critical in numerous ways. The money that came to Israel was essential in building the young state. In 1 year, 1956, the money that came from Germany accounted for 87.5% of their revenues. The trains, the electrical infrastructure, everything that a young country needed to become self-sufficient came in that first decade in particular as a result of these reparations. But this is some of the ways the people responded. Menachem Begin, interesting little footnote. He he was an amazing actor in Israeli history, I'm sure as you know. He was a terrorist, or some of us might call him a freedom fighter, prior to Israel's independence. He obviously, as we remember, he became a prime minister many years later. He led some of the revolt against the agreement, basically saying you're Nazifying Israel. You're Nazifying Israel. We're not going to take their blood money, I think is what the core of what they were saying. But if we just go back, I want to say there was an attempt to dynamite the Knesset. A man was arrested trying to carry a dynamite into the Knesset. And a Jewish man. I mean, this is, today, you know, this obviously has different repercussions when we hear this. A letter bomb exploded, killing one person. It was actually somebody trying to set the bomb, but it was an attempt to, you know. It was, that's the level that it brought. So that's an interesting data point to see that the whole idea of working with Germany in a reparative mode is by itself controversial. So another data point. 1953, Knesset passes the Yad Vashem law, passed unanimously. I haven't checked this out. It's probably the only time anything ever passed unanimously through the Knesset, but it did pass unanimously. But look at the pairing of they didn't establish Yad Vashem. They established a remembrance authority. It's a government, right? That's how they're going to do things. Martyrs and heroes remember. So right there, martyrdom and heroism tied together, unifying a perspective on the Holocaust. Not a cause and effect. I think that's a really important thing to point out, but tying the relationship together in an indelible way. 1962, Adolf Eichmann, who actually was a fairly low-level functionary, is kidnapped in Argentina, brought back to Israel 2-year trial, and he's the only man not only sentenced to capital punishment in Israel, but it's actually carried out. He's the only man ever hung in Israel. It's the first time Israel really confronts itself, looks itself in the mirror about the Holocaust. We've heard terrible stories about how survivors were treated in Israel. They were called soap because they were victims. And this heroism, the giborization, could not handle the fact that these people couldn't fight for themselves. The whole Nazi system was designed to eliminate any possibility for revolt. This is the first time people in Israel are able to start having that conversation. And this too is controversial. We have Hannah Arendt on one side who's making an intellectual argument that it's completely inappropriate for Israel to be doing this. And we have historians on the other side saying, why are we getting so excited? He wasn't Himmler, he wasn't Hitler, he was a lower level guy. Why are we sticking him in a glass booth and making this a national and an international event? So again, in Israel, 3 Jews, 18 opinions. But it was a critical moment in Israel's understanding of its identity relative to the Holocaust. Let's fast forward to the year 2000. Here in the United States, New York laws in a large part are able to bring Swiss banks to making a deal, a $1.25 billion deal, to essentially pay back money that should have gone to Holocaust victims or their surviving kin, and has been it's basically disappeared. It's literally almost disappeared from their books. In Israel, a 5-year study is undertaken by the Knesset, starting in 2000. 2005, the study is completed. The first shekel is not paid till October of 2009. So in the very state that's housing the people who have been wronged, and who have to some extent been wronged by these banks, the Israeli banks, you name the bank and they're part of what happened. It's a dirty relationship. It's a complicated relationship, and in some ways it's no different than other relationships with other banks and the victimized people all at the same time. And then finally, we have our current Consul General, Yaki Dayan, who never misses an opportunity to talk about Israel's responsibility to every Jew in the world. And I love the way he says it. He says, Israel exists so that no Jew anywhere has to be afraid again. We can't come to that 60 years after the founding is my math right? After the state of Israel, if we don't have an understanding of the Holocaust and what it meant as the ultimate anti-Semitic pogrom, whatever you want to call it, genocide. Certainly, I don't mean to minimize it as a genocide. Whatever you call it, it's the ultimate expression of it, and we have a country that has defined itself to protect us against it and to protect us from the world. But when we limit Israel only to that perspective, and that's what we do sometimes when we start to mix together the Holocaust and the founding of the state, we're deflating it. That's what I think we were upset about when Obama spoke in Cairo, and he reiterated that history. We were upset because he's missing this nuance, and he's a smart guy, and he's a well-educated guy. And if he's making that mistake, other people are making it too. And I would venture to say that probably 80 or 90% of us in this room have made that mistake. And it may be an issue of shading, but I think we want to analyze that, and we want to reassess it. We want to shade it differently, because to do otherwise is to delegitimize Israel's right to exist.